listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana DeCristofaro, and produced by Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. I don't know if you all know this, but of all the pieces of putting a podcast episode together, writing and recording the introduction is the hardest one for me to do. This could be surprising for the people in my life who know how much I love to monologue, but when it comes to Grief Out Loud, it's intimidating to try and summarize not just a layered conversation, but the guest I had that conversation with, and to do it in less than 2 minutes. Today's guest, Micere Freelon, exemplifies this difficulty because of the vastness of his work in this world, and also because he's an incredible storyteller with deep and nuanced understandings of grief, artistry, and pretty much everything we talked about, including scientific phenomena. Micere Freelon is a Grammy-nominated musician, author, and educator from Durham, North Carolina. He's also a son, a father, a husband, and an astute observer of life and grief and everything in between. We originally planned to talk about Micire's experience of caregiving and grieving for his father, Phil, a renowned architect who died of ALS, and also about Micire's newest children's book, Daddy and Me, Side by Side, which is a beautiful rendering of the times Micere and his father spent in nature and how he's creating similar experiences with his own son, Justice. We did talk about those, but just a few hours before we started the interview, Micere got word that an influential professor from his graduate school experience, Dr. Mugo, had just died. So our conversation expanded in scope and meaning. Micire's story may be familiar to some of you, as I had the opportunity to interview his mother, Nneena Freelon, back in episode 202. If you haven't listened to that conversation, be sure to check it out after this one. Micere, thank you so much for taking time to be on Grief Out Loud with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I know I mentioned this in our intro, but listeners, this is the first time that we have had a mother-son duo on the podcast separately. So I did an interview with Micire's mother, Nneena, about 2 years ago now. So I'm really looking forward, Micere, to kind of hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's big shoes to follow. My mom is quite the storyteller and orator, so I'll do my best.
How would you like to introduce yourself today?
Well, I am Nneena and Phil's son, Queen Mother Frances Pierce, Charles, Alan, and Elizabeth's grandkid. I'm Katie's husband, Justice and Stella's dad. Those are all the probably most important titles. I'm an artist. I make songs and puppets and shows and books about things that matter to me and my family and my community, from a Afrofuturist Black galactic lens. And yeah, that's there's my intro for today. It's kind of a lengthy and awkward bio, but yeah, I'm just the guy that makes art.
And I know we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking about the relationship you had with your father, Phil, who died in 2019, and about your book, Daddy and Me, Side by Side. In this moment, which loss or losses feels important to bring into the room, so to speak, or our conversation?
Yeah, well, loss is an interesting word. My dad is passed away, but I feel his presence daily. In fact, I'm sitting right in front of his altar up behind me to the left here. It's a bunch of Black science fiction action figures. There's a picture of my dad asleep on a couch. There's some incense and candles. So I don't know, an astrophysicist would say nothing is created or destroyed. It's only transformed. And I believe that that's true. I think we came from somewhere and I think we returned back to that place. So, if you look at a caterpillar, maybe you'd say that they lost something as they metamorphosized into a butterfly. Maybe you'd say they gained something or they just changed. So, my dad's presence is always with me, and I feel really love. That's what I feel for him. Part of air quotes losing a person is like you miss that energy, that loving energy. Let me speak from my personal experience. That has been my experience with my dad. There are lots of different types of griefs, and you could grieve things in different ways. But when I think about my dad, love is the word that comes up. That love is not lost. It still lives within me, and it's channeled through the work that I do. It inspires my parenting practice, how I husband and how I son how I shine like a sun. Um, I told you before we hopped on today that I recently, like less than an hour ago, got a call from one of my mentors that, a very dear person to me passed away today. Her name was Micere Githae Mugo, Dr. Micere Githae Mugo. She was the chair of the African American Studies Department at Syracuse University, where I went to grad school. She was a loving, thoughtful, revolutionary activist, scholar, playwright, poet, creative, powerful, light being. I don't know how else to describe her. She was warm, funny, kind, but also just rigorously intellectual, principled, focused. So her quote loss, air quotes again for anyone who's listening and can't see the bunny ears flopping. Her physical body has transitioned from a vessel of her spirit to some minerals and cells that will decay and reintegrate into the ground. But her spirit is not lost, and the love that I feel for her and that I'm feeling for her in this moment is, it's rich. It feels very close to me, and I cherish the feeling. I think it can be scary at first because you cry. Like I had a good cry right before this call. Good cry. There's more cries coming. I can feel that I'm not done crying, but I'm not scared of those tears. They're precious, and just like she was precious, is precious. When I get a moment to breathe, after the initial just kind of shock of it all, of the news, there's a lot of gratitude there. Gratitude for how she mentored and loved me and poured into me and taught me how to pour into others. Gratitude that I'm, right now holding her books of poetry and prose that are parts of her legacy that I can dive into and be and like hold space with her, from the other side through these gifts that she left behind. I'm one of those gifts that she left behind. Anyway, those are some thoughts. Big question, big answer. Sorry, I'm long-winded.
You talked about like just getting the news just before hopping on this interview today. I wonder if there's ways in which the grief that's coming up for your mentor's death feels familiar with the grief of your dad's death.
Yeah, there's familiarity there. Because the love is familiar. I'm lucky. I was a well-loved child. You met my mom, you already know what she's about. My dad was a sweet guy, and they loved each other very much. And he died on the year of their 40th anniversary. They showed me what self-love looks like. They love themselves and each other and our family very much. Part of my inheritance in the wake of my dad's death, there's a lot of paperwork and business and There's a lot of questions and, legal conversations, some of which deal with inheritance. What did this person leave you? When I think about inheritance and legacy and heritage, a big part of my inheritance are those values that he left me, the kind of nurturing spirit, the optimistic kind of worldview, the kind of generosity and attitude of gratitude. Those are all things that I inherited from my dad and my grandmother, my mom's mom, Queen Mother Frances Pierce. She used to always say, keep an attitude of gratitude. It's the kind of thing that's annoying to hear when you're a kid, but then you get older and you're like, oh wow, gratitude is actually like healthy. It's something that can improve your mental health. And it's something that when you're in the throes of sadness can help reground you back in a practice of abundance. I'm sad because I miss these amazing people that I was lucky enough to be around. And there's way more gratitude than there is sadness for me. So yeah, there are aspects. So anyway, to answer your question, those are things that is my inheritance. And grieving, air quotes, the reason I'm using air quotes on the word grieving is because I think that it's actually, the word grief has, an energy to it, at least in the English language and the American and African American cultural traditions that I come through. It's like synonymous with sadness. And while sadness is kind of a part of grieving, I think that the major emotion that I feel is actually love. And the word grief doesn't fully encapsulate it. I know through practice that it does, but for an uninitiated listener who is unfamiliar with the intimate dance with grief that we will all inevitably experience if we live long enough and are lucky enough to have meaningful relationships, sadness is like, I don't know, 3-4% of it. And the rest of it is love. If you had a loving relationship, grief can take a lot of forms, but I'm speaking specifically with my relationship to my dad, the correlation that I see with my relationship to Dr. Mugo. This was a dope human being that I got to spend time with. And there's sadness that they're not there anymore and that you won't be able to have those same types of experiences moving forward. But what about the how old was I when my dad died? 36, 37 years of awesomeness that I did get to experience. That's love. I'm glad that I got that. If being sad that I don't get it anymore means that I get to experience it at all, I'm like that, my dad used to talk about, scales, weigh the positives and negatives. If I ever had a decision to make in life, think about it like a scale, put a rock on the negative and a rock on the positive, and whatever's heavier at the end, helps you decide what to do. And the rock of sadness, it's a heavy rock. I'm not discounting the fact that it exists or that it's weighty, that it's dense. But that's one rock on the, air quotes, bad side. On the good side is like trips to the camping trips. That's what my book, Daddy and Me Side by Side, is about. Riding on my dad's shoulders, going to baseball games, eating his lasagna, playing in the boom boom room at his office with Dr. Mugo, was being exposed to, Chinua Achebe and Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and all the wonderful authors that she exposed me to, dinners at her house, going out dancing at my graduation party. She's out there 70, busting a move. Like, there's so much to be grateful for, so much joy, so much abundance. And that's really what it is. The grief is just like, oh man, I can't do that anymore. But I'm so glad that I got to do that, as a part of it too. And so, yeah, it's just yes, that stone in the sad portion of the equation deserves to be recognized and felt in its fullness. But what's there when the dust settles from the impact of that, that grief like meteor is like this mineral dense crater that's full of awesome things and memories that I'm grateful for. Yeah, I think that love is like that's the lesson. That's what I realized grieving my dad's death. That's what feels familiar about grieving Dr. Mugo's death, and other loved ones. Sometimes people pass away and I don't feel much. There's a grief there. It's like, wow, I guess the relationship wasn't as deep as I thought it was. I wasn't as close to this grandparent as I was to the one where I was doubled over, bawling, crying when they passed away. I just didn't have as much to draw from. That's what I learned from really being in the throes of love when my dad died. That's what I'm feeling now about Dr. Mugo.
You've already done an amazing job of kind of painting a picture of your dad for us, and some of the things that you've mentioned, but I'm wondering if there's a particular story about him you feel called to share today.
Ooh, story about dad. Let's see. Well, one of his favorite things that he shared with me, this is actually kind of related to Dr. Mugo too, because it was something that was reaffirmed in something she shared with me about fractals. It's a video called The Powers of 10. It was some like 1970s short film. It's like 10 minutes long, and it shows the basically like a couple on a blanket in New York. And it kind of, I think at first it zooms out and then it zooms in. So as it zooms out, each frame is like, what do you call that? An order of magnitude bigger than the last, moving away from the people on the blanket. So the first one, you're just right there with the couple, then it's like 10 feet up and 10 miles up. And by a power of 10, it gets farther and farther away. So, eventually you're looking at the state of New York and then the country and then the world and then the solar system and, larger it gets to the galaxy, then the galaxy cluster, then the universe. It scales and you get an idea of how small we are as you watch this camera move out and move up. And then when it kind of reaches the edge of the known universe, it kind of zooms back into the couple in the city. And then it, by the same factor, zooms inward to the hand, to the skin cells, to the atoms that make up the cells and the particles that make up the atoms. By the powers of 10, it zooms out. By the powers of 10, it zooms inward. What you realize in observing this thought experiment is the universe at its largest scale looks very similar to the to the universe at its smallest scale. And when I got to grad school and met Dr. Mugo, she talked about the existence of fractals in nature. And that is actually, I didn't know that I was looking at a fractal relationship when I saw The Powers of 10 as a kid. It's like a mathematical concept. Any class of geometric shapes at its smallest and at its largest has basically the same shape. Not to get too nerdy on y'all, but the reason I think that that's interesting is because to me it kind of just reveals that, I mean, for lack of a better, esoteric term, like everything is everything. That's the truth that it revealed to me. Here's a fractal relationship with my dad, right? So when I was born, my dad kind of took care of me and nurtured me into being. When I was born, I got to do that for my son. It's like a fractal relationship. The same way that he nurtured me, I was nurtured. I got to provide that nurturing for my son. And here's an interesting fractal on the other end. That's the zoom in. On the zoom out, when my dad died or was dying, he was diagnosed with a disease called ALS. The care that I took to send him off as one of his primary caregivers was so similar I was struck by this. It was so similar to the care that I gave my son. He needed help with some of the same things that a child needed help with. It was wild. ALS is a disease that gradually paralyzes the body. And just like when a kid is little, they can't walk, they can't talk, they can't eat, except certain types of foods, milk, liquids. Nobody's looking at a baby saying, "Oh, this poor, this poor being." It just is. And then you know that there's a natural progression. It's going to grow into these abilities. But guess what? We're going to grow out of these abilities too. And you need somebody there who's going to care for you, who's going to tend to you, who's going to make sure that you're not putting something in your mouth that you can't swallow. You know what I mean? That is an act of care and an act of love. And reframing my mindset from like, oh, my dad's losing his ability. It was like, no, this is actually a completely normal process. And just like I'm not judging my kid for not being able to walk, of course he can't walk. He's a baby. I'm not gonna like bereave my dad for not being able to walk. Of course he can't walk. He's dying. Like he's on his way out of this life, not in. And guess what? If I'm lucky, when I'm elderly, I hope my son will be around to be able to spoon feed me whatever I need to eat, wipe my butt, lay me down to bed, sing me a bedtime story until I'm gone. And hopefully his son or daughter or beloved community, whoever he's got around him, he'll have those resources to be able to send him off as well. It's a fractal relationship. It's a circle. It's the same. I think the powers of 10 helped me realize that. And literally every human being who's ever lived has gone through what my dad went through. And guess what? The 6-7 billion of us who are here now are going to go through the same darn thing. 9 billion. I don't know how many people are alive currently, but we're all headed in the same direction. And best to cherish our time while here and hope for a loving exit and entrance, and some love in between. My dad had that. He provided that for me. I hope to have that, on my way out. That Powers of 10 gift helped kind of ground me in that reality.
And this question just came to me, so if it's too weird, we can skip it. But I'm wondering, you've talked a lot about the continuity of connection, your dad's energy, and your dad was a renowned architect. And so I'm now picturing how he left a part of himself in these buildings that he created and formed and designed. And I wonder how you think about that, of his energy being embedded in these like legacy objects that he has left here.
Yeah, I absolutely feel my dad's presence in the buildings that he has designed. And listen, art is spirit work. And my dad was an artist. He designed buildings. So among the types of buildings he designed, because he was intentional about how he used his gifts, he didn't design prisons, he didn't design casinos, though he was offered contracts and money to do those things. He designed museums, he designed schools. I think he's probably one of the most prolific architects of Black cultural museums in this country. In fact, I think he's done the most in the United States. The National Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, the Reginald F. Lewis Black Cultural Center in Baltimore, the Museum of the African Diaspora in Detroit, of course, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. These are buildings that aren't just an expression of his talent and his genius as a person who can kind of visualize a structure and set the wheels in motion for it to come into being, and now people can interact with it. But it's also what's in these what's in these buildings. What's in these buildings is the legacies and the stories of so many African American folks who didn't have the space, platform, access to the capital and real estate to tell their stories. He created these vessels for storytelling that will endure long beyond his physical presence, long beyond his and my time on this planet. And that's cool. That's really cool. But there's also this way in which I remember there was this healer lady who was working with my dad, and she raised a really interesting question, specifically about the Smithsonian Museum, but really about a lot of his museum work. What kind of toll does that take on a human being to kind of bear the weight of your ancestors in that way? There's obviously a lot of trauma in the Black American story. And if you go into the first three floors of the National Museum in Washington, D.C., you'll get a sense of that. There are, records of the hundreds of thousands of Black lives that were lost, the trauma of bondage, of perpetual servitude, of torture, well into the present. The Emmett Till's casket is down there. It's Nat Turner's Bible. These stories of just survival against all odds. But sometimes it's not all survival. There's a lot of deep harm and ancestral trauma that was healed through the work that he did in building a space for those spirits to say, this is my story. And what the spirit lady said was, that has an impact. If you could imagine the holders of these stories, the triumphant ones and the traumatic ones, that spirit work doesn't just slide off your shoulders. It becomes absorbed by the folks who take on the Herculean, but I'm gonna use a West African deity, since Hercules is, European. We'll say the Oshunian task. Oshun is a river spirit in the West African tradition. That task of holding these stories, being a vessel for all of it, that seeps into your pores. And she wondered if his disease was somehow related to this undertaking. That's an interesting thought experiment. The taking on this responsibility, this sacred charge of creating a vessel for the collective stories and legacies of people. It's a lot. It's heavy. Even now, just every time I think about that, it impacts me at a spiritual level. And like I said, my dad was well loved and was a thoughtful, intelligent, loving, empathetic guy. But he was a strong man, and his shoulders were broad enough, his heart was strong enough to carry that load, so that those of us who are still here, can experience those stories in a beautiful, functional, and emancipatory space. So I have a lot of gratitude for him taking that responsibility on, while also acknowledging that this kind of work has consequences. Yeah, but somebody's got to do it. That was part of his journey. It's a sacrifice that he made on our behalf, and I'm grateful to him. It's a noble thing that he did for us as Black people in this country. So yeah, that's I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I feel when I think about his gift to many gifts to this country.
It leaves me wondering, Pierce, given that sort of recognition of the responsibility that your dad took on in the creation of these locations, these holders of these stories, has that played a role in the type of creator that you are? Because you are also an artist and you are also a creator of mediums for people to engage with. And I just wondered if that's played a role in the way you create.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my dad, and I'm lucky to have him in my bloodline, so that's special. I can feel certain aspects of his being coursing through me, my DNA, literally. And that's really dope. My friend Omi Sade, Bernie Scott, she's a healer, and she has a really cool podcast called The Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. She talks about how we have ancestors in our cultural through line as well. I'm not an architect like my dad, though I can learn things from him. I also have cultural ancestors like, Bob Marley, Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, Tupac in the hip hop space, the, storyteller who speaks truth to power. These folks have offered me a blueprint, unintended, for how to use my particular skill set to fulfill my purpose on this earth, part of which is being a storyteller, using my privilege and my voice and my talents and networks to tell a story through a particular lens. That lens, in my case, being the Black experience, the fatherhood experience, the American experience, and the genre in which I create music these days. It's through kids' media, children's picture books, children's music. It's interesting in this country, we don't have a lot of tools to engage kids in questions around grief. There are some cultures that do have those tools. The indigenous, Chicano communities have Day of the Dead, and it's not Halloween where you just dress up and go out and collect candy. It's a ancient ritual around recognizing, honoring, and celebrating your ancestors. And, because they have that ritual and that tradition, kids kind of, if you've ever seen the movie Coco, it's a great example. Kids kind of grow up with an understanding that, death is a normal part of life. And then here's a time where we celebrate it every year. We don't have those same kind of mores in the American tradition. Yeah, using my gifts to tell those stories in culturally accessible ways to the communities that I come from is how I say thank you to my dad and to the other trailblazers and influencers who poured into my being and helped shape my worldview, like Dr. Mugo. She does it at the college level through graduate students. My graduate students are babies and parents. And my classroom is Spotify, YouTube.
Let's talk about your new book, Daddy and Me, Side by Side. Yeah, what do you want to share about kind of the origin of that story?
The origin, I guess, was spending quality time with my dad. He was really into nature and nature as a healing space. His dad's dad, so his grandfather, Alan Freelon Sr., who was a Harlem Renaissance impressionist painter, he used to take him out to his art studio in Philadelphia, and they would go out into the woods and sit there in nature and just close our eyes and listen. He would ask them, "Well, what do you hear?" And, you listen and breathe, and I hear the breeze, I hear the trees, I hear the frogs, you know, it's like a form of meditation. I think in some Asian cultures, they call it forest bathing now. It's like a healing modality. My ancestors, including my dad, had an affinity with nature, and they found peace and grounding and love and healing and joy and curiosity out in nature. And my dad raised me the same way, going fishing, going camping, sitting on logs, looking for worms under stones, and teaching me how to be a loving, thoughtful, reflective individual. That's what we're doing, sitting in silence. It's an opportunity to reflect, to breathe, to unplug, to heal. These were all things that were part of my childhood. So when my dad passed away and I was grieving his loss, I went back to those places that he took me to. I went back to those creeks. I went back to those trails. I went back to those creatures and trees and streams. And I always felt good when I left, better than I did when I arrived. And I wanted to write a book about that. I wanted to share some of those healing practices with folks who are experiencing loss. I mean, and again, before the book, like I remember one day, my son Justice, I was taking him to school. I don't, maybe Stella was sick that day. I can't remember why she wasn't with us, but I was taking him to school. He was feeling really sad. I was feeling really sad. I was like, man, let's just go to the woods. Like instead of school. Of course he was down with that. Um, Took a detour, made a U-turn, went to the Eno, went hiking for about an hour and a half, did some meditating, did some walking, talking, quality time. And then I dropped him off at school around noon. It was as much for me as it was for him. Yeah, I'm just really grateful that my dad exposed me to that kind of stuff. And, I've been able to pass that forward to my son. And that's really the contents of the book. It's me and Justice going on a nature walk, going fishing, and remembering our pop. Very autobiographical. That's kind of the backstory on how it got started.
How does it feel for you having it out in the world now since it just came out in May of this year, 2023, right?
Yeah, yeah, it feels great. It's inspired by a song called Side by Side, which is on my album Ancestors, album my mom and I made. Both the song and the album are just really beautiful. It's illustrated. The book is illustrated by an amazing illustrator, Nadia Fisher. And we just had a show in South Dakota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where I'm reading the book over a sound bed of live music. And then there's like this big jumbotron, and we're projecting the book onto the screen and did like a live musical story time reading of the book. After the show, the venue, the people who invited us were like, "Your show was amazing. We danced, we cried, we loved up on each other, and it's just different. Like a lot of children's music is about, learning numbers and shapes. A lot of it is about, joy and fun. I've got songs about brushing your teeth and getting tucked into bed and, having a dance party and all types of fun topics. But we found a way to make this topic kind of fun and engaging too, and relatable for anyone who's ever lost a grandparent or even a pet or had to move from one city to another and you miss your friends. Like kids deal with these feelings of loss. I think it's important that we have books and stories and shows that expose kids to healthy ways of processing these emotions. There's a point in the book where Justice is feeling emotional about missing his grandpa, and his pop, as we call him, say it's okay, let it out. I'm here. Those types of teaching a young boy that it's okay to be vulnerable and expressive is really important because there's a lot of narratives out there of like, suck it up, don't cry, be a man. These are the the toxic masculinity, unhealthy values that are perpetuated in this kind of just patriarchal culture that we live in. And I wanted to disrupt that, but also just to tell an authentic story that honored my dad and what he taught me about fatherhood.
Well, Pierce, I'm grateful for your book. I'm so glad that it's out in the world right now, and I feel grateful to have this time together to talk about it. As our conversation does come to a close, is there anything else you feel like you want to share or tell us today?
No, I think I would say for anyone out there who's grieving, to check out other episodes of your wonderful podcast and also my mom's podcast, Great Grief. Daddy and Me Side by Side is a great resource, and our album Ancestors, I think, is a great resource too for kids and adults to just to check in with each other on how they're feeling around loss. Appreciate you having me on, and it's a wonderful conversation.
And I know you mentioned, Pierce, that you are on Spotify and YouTube. Is there any other place that listeners should go to connect with you?
Yeah, my website, my name is Pierce, like Pierce Your Ear, Pierce. Last name Freelon, Freelon. And that's my website. That's actually my Twitter, Instagram, Facebook website. Everything is just first name, last name. PierceFreelon.com is my website. You can find everything there. Oh, one more thing actually that's coming up this summer is my mom and I are taking the songs from our album Ancestors, and we're scoring a puppet show. And we're doing a 27 all ages family puppet theater here in North Carolina every weekend for the entire months of August and September in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area. So if you're interested in checking out a show or seeing how some 40-foot puppets deal with some of the topics we've discussed, I hope you'll join us here in North Carolina.
Well, listeners, as always, I put all of that in the show notes so you can find Pierce and all of his amazing work. And I'll also link to the episode that I did with Pierce's mom, Nneena. And yes, definitely check out her podcast, Great Grief. It's phenomenal. So Pierce, thanks again for making time, for sharing with me today, and for connecting with everyone who's tuned in.
Thank you.
And listeners out there, I say it each and every time, thank you for being part of our community, for making this show mean something in the world. And for those of you who have reached out to connect with me, if you do want to connect with me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougie.org. That's dougy.org. That's also our main website, where you can find all of our downloadable resources, information about our local programming, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. I'm always excited to share that our podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.